Great, we'll give it another minute just while people log in. And hopefully you can all see my screen now. Cool, great. Well, I'll make a start. Welcome everyone to this webinar. Really exciting to have you with us, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speakers. My name is Daniel Gash. I'm a senior engineer at Trafficworks and also part of the board at ITE, and I'll be your moderator for today. And our topic is integration of urban design, transport and planning and engineering. So ITE ANZ is a section of the Institute of Transportation Engineers and based in Australia and in New Zealand. As an overview, the ITE ANZ is an international membership association of transport professionals who work to improve mobility and safety for all transportation system users and help build smart and livable communities. So at the moment we have over 15,000 members in 90 countries, and we always welcome new members. So, and for students as well, the membership is free for the first year. So highly recommend that you join up. I'd just like to also start with an acknowledgement of country, and ITE acknowledges the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. ITE also acknowledges any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are with us in today's event. And ITE acknowledges and respects the Treaty of Waitangi and Maori as the original people of New Zealand. We acknowledge people of Maori descent who are also with us in today's event. So on behalf of ITE, I'd also like to acknowledge our generous sponsors who, by their financial support, not only support the operations of ITE ANZ, but also sharing our ethos to improve in transport and create a better world. We are proud to have Traffic as our platinum sponsor, sponsoring our student award. We also have Trafficworks sponsoring our President's Dinner and Postgraduate Award. We're proud to have Sidra Solutions. And we'd also like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Arup, Movement and Place Consulting, and O'Brien Traffic. ITE ANZ are always open to partnering with you and your respective companies. So if any of your companies or yourselves who are in this webinar are interested in supporting the work of ITE and partnering as a leader in the field of transport, we'd love to get in touch for an obligation-free conversation to find out a little bit more. So just some housekeeping. We've got an option you'll see if you kind of hover down the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function. So rather than typing your questions in the chat, if you can use the Q&A function, that would be really great. And we'd encourage you to type in any questions that you'd like to ask in that chat, and we'll try and get through as many as we can at the end. Quickly, a couple of YIT upcoming events. So we've got Ratio Open Day. So come along and meet the team and have your career questions answered at Ratio Consultants Open Day. So this is calling all students, graduates, young professionals, town planners, urban designers, transport specialists, or environmental consultants. And we'd love to invite you for a tour of Ratio's Cremorne office, a social lunch and chance to chat with our fantastic team. So that'll be a great event to come along to. Another YIT upcoming event is the general meeting, and that's going to be a hybrid, so online and also in-person event at Ratio's office. Again, same address as before. So on the 28th of June at 5:30 p.m. Nominations are opening soon, so keep an eye on the ITE ANZ website and social media platforms. And there's also Matt's email up there on the screen as well if you've got any more questions. So that's enough of me talking. I'd like to welcome our first speaker for the presentation today. And so we've got Bernard Chan, who's a Senior Associate at Trafficworks. Bernard has significant experience in developing pedestrian and bicycle improvement, road safety and streetscape projects for both local and state government. Bernard is a keen cyclist and understands the challenges of designing bicycle facilities within the road network and applies his experience to projects to improve safety for pedestrians and cyclists and to promote cycling and walking as an attractive mode of transport. Through his work, Bernard has applied the movement and place framework on a wide range of projects to balance the accessibility needs for different road users on the network. Bernard is also one of the facilitators in the Department of Transport accredited movement and place assessment training and pedestrian and cyclist design training. So I'd like to welcome Bernard, and if you'd like to take control of the screen and share your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel, for that. So, hello, everyone. So today, in my presentation, I'll be talking about the role of movement and place in street planning and design. So why do we need movement and place? A road or a street is a movement conduit, and many of us are in the business of moving people and goods from A to B as efficiently and as safely as possible. But it's also important to recognize that a road and a street is also a place. It's a destination in its own right. So for local governments, planners and business owners, they're in the business of extending dwell time with people dining and shopping. So in many locations on our network, there's an inherent conflict on our streets, where some of us are trying to minimize the commute time and others are trying to extend the dwell time. So the movement and place thinking implies that while we're planning for and developing our network, we need to consider the needs for movement and place making simultaneously. So the movement and place is a framework largely helping users to deal with these conflicts. 15 years ago, we focused on vehicle speed, movement efficiency and capacity. So that was our traditional approach. It was all about moving how many vehicles, mostly cars and trucks, we could move, and a focus on dedicating road space to these vehicles. About 10 years ago, we made a step change to smart roads and included on-road public transport, pedestrians and cyclists, and shifted our thinking to the number of people we're moving, not just the number of vehicles. And now, movement and place takes us to the next step. So it's an integrated transport approach, bringing together transport and land use. So we're also now taking into account what's happening on the side of the roads and treating roads and streets as places in their own right. So movement and place is not a new concept, and we're not the only ones adopting this. It's happening everywhere around the world. There's quite an international community of practice, and we're not reinventing the wheel. And we're just taking the parts that works to suit a Victorian context from other states and countries. So the Victorian movement and place framework is largely based on London's Lincoln Place, and it's just evolved from there. Talk a little bit about the street space allocation challenge, as I'm sure a lot of you will be experiencing. When planning and designing streets, the allocation of street space is always strongly contested. And this is particularly the case in locations such as activity centres, where there's high traffic flow conflicts with popular places and key destinations. So movement and place can really help us with that challenge to allocate the road space equitably. So every user type takes up space and they travel at different speeds. Broadly speaking, taking public transport, walking and cycling are generally much more spatially efficient compared to the private vehicle. So this image shows how much space is required to move 50 people using the different modes of transport. So you can see it's much more efficient walking and cycling and taking public transport. And these comparisons really help us to prioritize space in our streets for movement of more appropriate and sustainable modes. And this is particularly important in the context of our growing urban environments and densification. When we're thinking about movement, it's also important to understand it's about the movement of people rather than vehicles, and to provide both residents and visitors a wider variety of attractive transport options. Multimodal streets support many modes and provide efficiencies by both moving and holding more people. It's also found that it could also move much more people per hour than a vehicle-oriented street. And when streets are able to facilitate more movement by balancing a variety of modes, it's likely that they also become much more accessible to people and are able to better support economic activity while also being more environmentally sensitive. In September last year, the study was commissioned by RMIT and Monash University. And in that study, they looked at 57 sites located in major activity centres, around 10 kilometres radius from the Melbourne CBD. So each of these sites were measured in terms of the amount of street width provided and is used by each mode of transport. So an understanding of current street space allocation and use can really help us identify locations where street space could be allocated more equitably to users. And this is particularly relevant in areas where movement and place objectives are in conflict with one another, such as in activity centres. In the study, observational person counts were undertaken, and these were classified by transport modes. And these were undertaken at each site and converted to a concentration of people per kilometre to determine the usage of each mode. And it was found that when averaged across all sites, space for pedestrians was found to be significantly undersupplied. And footpaths accounted for only 33% of the total street space, yet pedestrians accounted for over 56% of the people per kilometre of road space. The exclusive tram lanes, general traffic lanes, tram and bus lanes were found to be slightly oversupplied. And the elements that were found to be greatly oversupplied were on-street car parking, shared general traffic and bus lanes, and surprisingly bicycle lanes. A key takeaway from the findings is that space for pedestrians could really be increased at some activity centres. This could be potentially done through converting existing on-street parking, as in the case with the recent emergence of parklets. However, it is noted that there is great variability between sites, and this highlights the importance of a site-specific approach. So this is where movement and place approach comes in. I'll give a brief overview of the Victorian Movement and Place framework. So the framework examines the vision and performance of transport links against 4 themes: movement, place, safety, and the environment. The process to assess how these links are performing against the aspirational states takes us through 4 different modules of the framework: network classifications, network performance, options development, and options assessment. So I'll briefly cover through those 4 modules now. So module 1, network classifications, this is where each link of road can be plotted in a 5x5 matrix. And each classification has a definition, with place classified from P1 to P5, with P1 being a state significant place, right down to P5, which might be a local street that you live in. Movement also has classifications level 1 to 5, with M1 being corridors catering for mass movement of people and goods, so your freeways and your major highways, all the way down to an M5, which might be your local streets. The movement classification itself, however, doesn't add a lot of value until you unpack the different modes of transport that make up the M classification. So in our framework, there's 8 different transport modes that are recognized: rail, tram, bus interchange, walking, cycling, freight, and general traffic. And each of these transport modes also have their own classification system. Similar to movement, with place, it's also classified from P1 to P5, and also has subcategories as well. The first one is places of on-street activity, our PAs, and these apply where there are active street frontages, such as your strip shops or cafes. And the second one is places of off-street activity, and these apply where there's significant demand made on the transport network by large economic generators, but they might not have an active street frontage. So these could include things like your ports or airports or enclosed shopping centres. And the third is places of landscape and culture. So recognizing that there are some places which has that cultural significance. Once the aspiration of the road has been established through Module 1 and identifying those classifications, Module 2 then looks at how well the road currently performs in relation to its aspirational state. So there's a series of performance indicators for each theme of movement, place, safety, and environment. So through the network performance module, we then identify the scale of the gaps in performance, and then we can establish what outcomes we need to focus our change. So this shows an example output of Module 2, showing the comparison between the existing conditions to the target for a particular section of road. And it can be seen that in this example that walking represents the largest gap, followed by cycling. And this helps practitioners to understand where to focus change. And once we have the understanding of the gaps in your project, we can then derive our strategic project objectives. So this example here is just of Spencer Street outside Southern Cross Station. So these objectives will help shape your project options, which, moving on to Module 3, is options development. So once we've established our vision and we've examined it against our existing conditions to identify the gaps in the network, the next step is to identify our project options to address the identified gaps. There's a lot of guides that have been developed to assist with options development. And the first group of the guides is our roads and street design guide, which consists of the urban roads and street design guide, the rural roads typologies, and the growth area handbook. There's also a series of modal design guides, so cycling guide, walking guide, etc. And all of these design guides are supported by application guidance, such as the user guide and the movement in place technical appendix. Here's the next track showing the draft urban roads and street design guide. It's made up of a series of cross sections like this and shows an image of what the street might currently look like versus what it could look like and what interventions could be adopted. It's also important to note that movement in place in Victoria applies to all roads, including high-speed rural roads. So the rural road typologies guide will give cross sections for rural roads with a focus on safe system. So looking at making sure that we've got a safe system cross section for all our rural roads. Finally, once we've developed our options, the final step is then to assess each of the options to identify the resultant level of service expected from each project option. So this is an example output that is generated from this assessment. And this bar chart can be used to compare the aspirational level of service with the existing and each of the project options. And we can look at where the gaps lie and where each option addresses what transport mode. But the key thing to note here is that movement in place doesn't give us the answer of the preferred option, but instead it provides us guidance on the trade-offs to the modes that you might need to make. And it will help with that language to justify the the trade-off. So the framework can really help with providing that language and assist in creating that conversation in decisions on how to reallocate street space. Now, I'll just talk about how movement and place can integrate different disciplines and the importance of doing that. The movement and place framework provides a unified approach to thinking about roads and streets. And this allows practitioners to work together with different disciplines and perspectives to reach a shared understanding and collaboratively develop solutions, and also facilitates conversations between government, practitioners, and the community. The movement and place framework can also help define our road network into various street types, as you can see in that figure on the bottom right there. And by defining streets into certain types, we can immediately have a clear vision and direction for all stakeholders to collectively work towards and understand. The modal priorities that we can get from our modal classifications then provides a second layer of detail in defining the outcomes that we want. Traditionally, when we're looking at a street, the different elements of the street are planned and designed by different disciplines and authorities, and this could lead to fragmented outcomes. However, this is very different from how we experience the street, because we generally experience the street as a holistic place. The movement and place approach to street design recognizes this, and it integrates the collective expertise from different disciplines to provide a more holistic approach to delivering complete streets. Here's just a visual collage, which shows how the framework applies in a metropolitan Melbourne context. And this representation brings together a wide variety of factors and competing demands on roads and streets, and really demonstrates the importance of collaboration between different disciplines and stakeholders to realize the desired vision. So I'll just show a couple of images of what movement and place could look like when it's applied. This is an example of O'Connell Street in Auckland. So before, we were parking on both sides and one lane of traffic, similar to a lot of our streets and laneways in Melbourne CBD. And afterwards, the curbs and parking were removed, bikes, dining and tree planting, and pedestrians were given priority. And it's really transformed it into a place. So this is a more local example in our very own early application of movement and place. This is the Ringwood Station upgrade and boulevard treatment. So in this project, better priority for pedestrians was provided between the Eastland Shopping Centre and Ringwood train station with the implementation of a raised pedestrian crossing. And with the introduction of the Ringwood bypass, this has allowed Maruna Highway to be reduced from 3 traffic lanes to 2 traffic lanes in each direction. And a speed limit was also reduced from 60 to 40 kilometers per hour to better cater for pedestrians. This is another local example in High Street, Northcote, where tram stops were built out, parking were removed, and pedestrian access improved, which really improved the place and in terms of user experience. So now I'll talk a bit about some examples of how movement and place has been applied in street design. And I'll talk through some of the projects that I've been involved in. So here's an example of a project that Trafficworks completed in partnership with Hansen for the Wyndham City Council. So for this project, we reviewed the modal classifications for all of the streets within the municipality. We reviewed local strategies and also future planned projects. And from that, we established the ultimate active transport network within the municipality. So each of these identified routes were then categorized into street and path types. And this was used to inform a street design guide. So Gerhana will talk a bit more about this project in her presentation. This is another example of a project that we completed in partnership with Hansen. This involved the the preparation of a street design guideline for the city of Glen Eira. So on this project, we married up the movement in place framework together with Council's integrated transport strategy to come up with a street design guideline that will assist them in determining street typologies and aspirations based on the road hierarchy and classifications. Again, Gerhana will talk a bit more on this project. It's quite an interesting one on how movement in place was applied. We've also been using movement in place on various bicycle feasibility studies. So for a project that we did for City of Melbourne, for Courtney Streets, movement in place thinking was adopted in identifying the benefits of a proposed road closure to improve bicycle and pedestrian safety. And another project we completed for Bayside, which involved identifying routes which were suitable for protected bicycle lanes. And movement in place classifications was utilized as a criteria in a multi-criteria analysis. So in the streets, we also looked at protected bicycle lane feasibility study for the City of Melbourne. This was quite a complex project, given Flinders Street has so many competing modes and limited road space. And the movement in place framework was critical in understanding the modal priorities, and that was instrumental in helping us to establish the project options. It's also been used on a lot of streetscape projects that we've been involved in. So the first one was the Streets for People project we undertook in partnership with Hansen for the City of Darebin. The treatments that we recommended along each of the corridors that we looked at was based on movement in place classifications along the routes. The second one, Mason Street and Robinson Street, that we completed for City of Greater Dandenong, again in partnership with Hansen. Movement in place principles were adopted in the development of options. And the third one there, Lupton Way Shared Zone, was another interesting one that we completed again with Hansen, where there were competing pedestrian and cycling priorities with back of house loading and waste collection demands to balance. Apart from projects, the framework can also be used in the road operations area. The signals area within Department of Transport uses movement in place to undertake signal route reviews. And there's a guide and a number of matrices that looks like this one that helps prioritize modes at signalized intersections. The framework can also be used to inform policy as well. Here's some example of how the matrix can be applied to inform appropriate speed zones, or how on-street parking can be used, or to potentially inform a tree planting policy as well. So there's a lot of different and useful applications of movement in place, and it's not just on projects. Thanks for listening. That's the end of my presentation. I've got my contact details up there if you want to take a screenshot. As Daniel mentioned, Trafficworks is also the accredited facilitator for Department of Transport training. So if you want to find out a bit more on movement in place, feel free to get in contact with me. The next training course is in October. We're also the facilitators of pedestrian and cycling planning and design training, which is coming up on the 6th to the 8th of June. So again, if you're interested, feel free to contact myself. Thanks for listening. I'll hand you back to Daniel.
Cool. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you for that presentation. And I'll just reshare my screen. So yeah, just encourage you again, you've got the option to ask questions in the chat. We've already had quite a lot coming through, so looking forward to some question and answer time at the end. All right, just bear with me as I share my screen. So our next presentation will be from Gerhana, Waty, who's a director at Hansen Partnership. And having lived in Indonesia, Singapore, and Vietnam, Gerhana has traveled the world studying how cities can deliberately be designed to be exclusive. Having spent 20 years in Melbourne without a driving license, Gerhana channels her urban design expertise in championing streets for people. In 2019, Gerhana led the award-winning City of Darebin Streets for People project, shifting the lens through which streets and public realms are perceived as people-oriented spaces. Through her practice, Gerhana continues to work with other local governments, locally and internationally, towards an equitable urban environment for humans and non-humans. Gerhana is also involved in teaching at universities and a committee member of the Urban Design Forum, instilling the value of designing for all established and emerging designers. I look forward to hearing from Gerhana. I'll pass over to her now. You just need to unmute your microphone.
Thanks, Daniel, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm not sure how often you have urban designers coming and have a chat and share our project experience with you. So just building on what Bernard has presented earlier on movement and place, I'll be sharing my screen to share with you the project experience that we've had working together in Glenara and Wyndham in terms of how movement and place has been applied to demonstrate Streets for People strategies and to guide how implementation in terms of projects and active transport projects can be achieved through that process. So if you can bear with me for a second. Just confirming if everyone can see my screen.
Yep, I can see your screen. Thank you.
All right. So just pinching a slide from Bernard's really helpful presentation and launching pad for this discussion. One thing that we know critical in terms of delivering transport projects or placemaking projects is always the buy-in from multiple stakeholders, multiple ownerships, and also multiple expertise. A lot of the challenges that we face as designers, urban designers and landscape architects and planners are the different language that we all speak to each other. So when we talk about feasibility studies or concept design or functional design, everyone has a different idea of what it looks like, what it entails, the kind of commitment and the kind of resolution that it needs to deliver. So part of the project that we are looking at in Glenara, for example, is establishing a common language for different practitioners and experts and decision makers to understand what the aspiration for different streets will be that is influenced by state and local strategies. So it is really a marriage between taking council, state government's ideas of what streets and transport networks needs to be, down to translating that to lay person, who are your communities and landowners and developers, who are probably not equipped to talk in technical language, and trying to understand and unpack it and almost demystifying all these technical jargons so that everyone will be on the same page and have buy-in and projects can get delivered successfully that way. So that's part of the key ethos in terms of how we actually try to deliver these kind of projects in partnership with Trafficworks. All right, so the two projects that I'm going to share with you, one is in Glenara and one is Wyndham, completely different contextual settings and very different in terms of its landscape setting as well. But what is important is the strength of council strategies and the DOT movement and place framework in terms of laying the foundation and really useful starting point for us to do interesting and tangible outcome that can be delivered over time. So we all know where Glenara is. It is one of the middle ring suburbs. It's a very much greeted municipality, I must say. It's pretty rich in public transport in terms of train, tram, buses and whatnot. But what is useful in the Glenara setting is that the council has declared that 50% of their transport or traffic will be transferred to active transport in the future. And to deliver that kind of vision, whatever that underpins that vision, they need to have a serious commitment in delivering good streets to support non-motorized transport. In addition, they have other issues like urban heat island. They have issues with depleting canopy tree planting within the public realm. So there's all of these compounded issues that movement and place need to consider in addition to just the functionality of the transport modes. So on the left here, this is extracted from the ITS. They have very clear vision in terms of what streets are performing in terms of walking, cycling, and driving priorities. And on the right-hand side are usefully there what they call the city strategy or zoning plan, so to speak. So they have hierarchy of activity centers. As you can see, Bentley Major Activity Center, for example, is here. They have the Caulfield Neck over here. So there is a sense of what place and destinations are going to look like in the context of Glenara. So for those who have dabbled in DOT movement and place framework or have used that data set before, you would probably start to put one and one together. That place has always been defined through zoning, right? So commercial one is typically place of activity. Shopping centers, commercial one, tend to be place of off-street activity. What hasn't been picked up in a finer detail is other really localized destinations that people tend to walk to. Yeah, you're like open space, the trail networks, the school, the library, the little mini bar and milk bar and shops that don't get picked up as a big zoning cluster, but they are really important from the fine grained destinations perspectives. So what we did in Glenara is really translating Council's ITS, which surprise, surprise, doesn't really line up with DOT movement and place. Say, for example, Center Road in Bentley is identified as great shopping walking street. It makes sense because it is a high street shopping environment. However, the movement, general traffic, the bus network has a very high level of classification, meaning they have high priority in terms of making sure general traffic actually goes through. So the two doesn't necessarily line up very well, but usefully, DOT is also quite open to suggestion with regards to refining some of this movement and place, provided that there is a strong justification and strategic rationale as to why those classification must be reviewed or in some instances must be amended. And a really good example is the East Village Urban Renewal Precinct, which previously was Industrial 1. So naturally the movement categorization or the freight categorization is very high. But if we think about the strategic direction where this place is going to be in the future, it's very much a people-oriented space. As such, the movement and classification must be reviewed and must be amended to reflect what is the future designation of that place will be. So without going into too much detail, helpfully, what we did in the end is to have a place-driven street topologies to inform the aspiration and the model priority of different streets within the strategic corridor of Glenara. So whether this is still, high general traffic movement, but the aspiration in the ITS, there is a lot of strategic justification to demonstrate why the place value is actually one that drives the vision and what needs to happen in terms of prioritization of movement and efficiency and the like for what the future street will look like in the future. And also mind you that it's not just the streets, it's also the land use implication on what will happen on sites that is abutting these strategic corridors. Will future development support retail activity that spill onto the street? Will some of these streets support cycling corridor that connects to schools and parks and whatnot? So all of this becomes a language or a kit of parts that the community, the landowners, decision makers understand and can visualize and can commit to with regards to its delivery. So we're not talking in technical terms or technical language about general traffic classification, this and that. We talk about we are creating a boulevard here. We're creating a mixed activity street here. It has a different level of services. It has different level of quality and vibes in terms of place for people. So for the Glenara context, we've identified about 8 street types, and this is guided by the DOT draft street design guidelines. Again, the draft street design guidelines are useful, but they're not place specific. So where we have got to Glenara, we've looked at all the issues, the challenges. We studied every single carriage width. We studied every single footpath width. We studied where the trunk infrastructures are. We studied their flood issues to understand what is actually feasible in delivering the vision in the context of Gerhana, and therefore what is the street types that can be applied here, and what is the negotiation point that must be addressed to deliver the vision of overall. So I'm just going to flick through some examples here. So for every of the street types and the strategic corridors, we show them the existing cross sections, the challenges associated with that. In some area, it is not about providing a linear footpath along a strategic corridor. Rather, it is about creating safe crossing and creating a safe network of feeder streets that becomes the important factor in delivering the overall vision. And at the bottom here, we give them a couple of design options in terms of what the cross-section may look like and what negotiation points must happen to deliver the vision. Again, same example here. Connectors Road is interestingly have a role in terms of carrying public transport and general traffic. But as we know, even though the corridor is identified for primary driving routes, pedestrian amenity and safety and stress level still must be considered. So it is not necessarily saying, okay, therefore pedestrian is not considered. It's actually more important in terms of providing the sense of separation, the sense of buffer to reduce that level of stress, because a lot of the time these connectors road are the one that connect key important destinations together, and they're most direct. So commuters love them, not your recreation, not your young population who are using the streets, but they are the commuters, more confident street users who rely on these direct connections to get to places. So in that regard, amenity, shades, visual interests, wayfinding, all that kind of stuff are still really important consideration in addition to providing for driving and public transport. So where we land with the Gerhana context are really useful, what we call kit of parts. What are the elements that make up the streets? And how are these elements can be modified and customized to suit the different street types? Because not all street types need 4-meter footpath, right? Only certain footpaths need the 4-meter footpath width. Some areas can have narrower footpath because the density is not that high. And what kind of cycling infrastructure we need to deliver for different street types. So based on that, we have set up all these kind of kit of parts and framework to allow councils, decision makers, community to understand that in high activity streets, we want this type of cycling facility. We want an expectation of level of service and walkability and amenity for pedestrian. So not just in terms of transport, we've also looked at how streets is quite transient in nature. They are never static, we know that. It could be high traffic streets in the daytime. It could be really quiet on the weekend. Therefore, what are the opportunities that allow this flexibility, the transient nature of life, street life, community life that actually contributes to this valuable sense of place to the streets? How can we accommodate that without actually compromising the overall strategic vision for the place? Where is the negotiable space that we can work with in terms of contributing to local economy through delivering parklets, supporting electric vehicle parking? Do we want more cycling parking rather than car parking because it contributes better to the local economy? So all of that is actually being explained and deliberately geared towards street typology. So there is a very clear sense of direction, decision-making process of how we get there. Again, your wombat crossing, your zebra crossing may not be suitable on every streets. So we actually starting to create a framework to guide that decision-making process. And it continues. We go even to the point of green infrastructure, how tree spacing should be facilitated. We know that residential connected streets often have driveways interrupting those nature strips. Therefore, we try to understand the frequency of those interruptions within the Gerhana context through their subdivision pattern. And we start to understand what is the best placement for trees? What is the best placement for size of trees? Because sometimes the trunk infrastructure doesn't allow us to have sufficient root space to support the kind of landscaping outcome that we're after. We go into wayfinding, and I didn't include any slide here, but we even go into street palettes, because that is also important in terms of reinforcing the difference between street types. So as one travel from one street to another, you understand where you are in the context of Gerhana. Okay, that was a bit of a bullet train speed of presentation. Now I'll take you to Wyndham. Again, Wyndham is quite unique because half of the municipality is established. A small portion in Werribee is historical. And of course, as you know, there is a swathe of growth area, which has committed street networks and committed cross sections and whatnot, which have not necessarily been informed by movement in place. So there is a bit of a backtracking and retrofitting and thinking about how can that be addressed now that there is a greater expectation on active transport of projects that has been committed. How can we retrofit projects to suit that? As we know, the existing urban structure in Wyndham is partly gridded, partly remote and inaccessible, so to speak, other than by car. But also it has beautiful landscape nature that becomes a really important part of consideration in a network system. One thing that movement in place hasn't actually nailed well in the context of Wyndham project is the recognition of trail networks. How is that going to be plugged into the overall system, because they tend to be strategic in terms of how it connects different places and different municipalities. It serves so well with regards to community well-being. It is relied upon by commuters as part of their cycling network or walking network, but they're often really challenging because they're tight. They have a lot of environmental issues. So widening them, duplicating them, creating connections across the creek or across the water bodies is so hard. So part of this challenge as we go along and applying movement in place, we start identifying areas where it can actually, can this be better? You know, can some of these issues be raised in the next iteration of movement in place? So in terms of active transport in Wyndham, the project comprises of 4 parts, really interesting. The first is about, they're asking us the question, where are our active transport network? What does it look like? And what streets need to function as what? The second question they ask is, what is the guideline? What is the key parts that we need to deploy to deliver the vision and to deliver the street types that we are after? The third question they ask is, what are the project priorities? You know, like there are probably 300 projects that will stem out of this, but how do we prioritize projects so we can actually start demonstrating and get quick wins so that there is buy-in from community, buy-in from decision makers, there is culture of active transport, all that good stuff. And lastly, we have actually started to test. We go from this macro scale strategic thinking of movement in place down to concept design for Hoppers Crossing to demonstrate what it actually means in terms of placemaking, in terms of design, in terms of projects, and selling that as an idea to get the councillors and the decision makers very excited about committing to projects and creating future structure planning to support the kind of vision as an overall integrated network. Bernard has shown you this plan. Unlike Gerhana, Wyndham doesn't have ITS that shows us this is all great walking streets, this is all our trails, this is all our grid capillaries. We have to define that for them. Interestingly, the green capillaries, as you can see, follows the waterways network, and they are really the pedestrian highway that connects one part of Wyndham to the other part of Wyndham. Their connector roads, Derrimut Road, Old Geelong Road, are all the backbones that connect different suburbs. Again, they're so efficient because they're designed that way. They're so regular because they're designed that way, but they're not really conducive to invite, you know, community to walk up and down this corridor. Rather, they're more of a destination because they tend to also support bus networks. So what support destination for bus routes are the Streets for People, which is the pink network, and the white, which is the feeder networks. And those are mostly in council's jurisdiction. they can make decisions, they can invest, they can fund those projects. But because this is speaking DOT language, we are hoping that the partnership between local government and DOT is better because everyone shares the same aspiration. So that's part of the key point in terms of why this plan is so important. Another thing that hasn't been said here is the role of this trail in supporting not just transport and active transport, but also tourism, because there is a lot of tourism destination in the context of Wyndham that are untapped because the road network may not support the kind of activities, the kind of traffic generation that they want over there, but it can work very well in terms of creating tourism, nature tourism destination that works well with active transport facilities. I won't bore you with all of this description, but you got the gist in terms of what I'm saying. Again, so in support of the creation of the active transport and the ultimate network, we also prepared a very similar guidelines to Glenara for Wyndham. And we applied that and we said, all right, we have all of these kit parts, we have all these options. Let's test it in the place that is so not pedestrian friendly in Hoppers Crossing, because this is one of their major activity center. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, it's so important in terms of identifying the path types. Again, they are driven by movement and place. More movement, yes, place, but not so evident. But in terms of place, when we're talking about place, it goes beyond just zoning. It goes into the built form conditions. It goes into the kind of land use that is supporting at the ground level. It tends to understand what are the key destinations that we're also creating at the very local levels. And what kind of amenity are we providing for pedestrians so that there's actually incentives that they want to walk around here. And what is the ultimate vision in addition to functionality, in addition to capacity, all these technical things, it's really about health, the urban health, community health and well-being, and the place health. So as part of that, these 4 key principles become the basis for concept definition for Hoppers Crossing. How do we retrofit Hoppers Crossing from really car-dominated place to much more people-oriented, place that some attract investment, the right kind of investment. It is a place where we turn on Geelong Road to a linear park opportunity. How does it all work out and what does it mean in terms of the technicality of it? So we've created a couple of cross sections. We work with Trafficworks to work out the functionality in terms of can turning movement be facilitated? Can the tram be facilitated? How is the bus interchange going to work? So all of that goes beyond just, you know, property boundaries to property boundaries within the carriage width. It goes beyond just private land. It needs to also be influencing what's happening on the public land. So out of this process, part of the implementation is actually for council to start preparing urban design framework and built form framework to understand how the private land can help deliver the active transport vision. Part of it could be including building setback for footpath widening. It could be mandating canopy tree planting within front setbacks and whatnot, so that it talks to the public realm in delivering the final outcome. Again, we go to the point of creating landscape concept as a demonstration of how this can be done. And we even cost that whole package for council in terms of if we are to do this, a couple of steps need to happen and it will cost you this much. So you can start seeing in terms of how in a Wyndham context, we go from the macro level of movement and place as a strategic tool to drive decision-making process and to justify why we're doing what we're doing. It goes to the street design guidelines. So it gives option and decision-making framework for council, developers, communities, DOT, so that they speak the same language and share the same vision. And we go to the point of into concept and placemaking initiative to then start to make it more tangible in terms of what does movement and place look like when it's actually a place, not just a street. With that, I will end my presentation. If you are after my contact detail, feel free to screen grab this or get in touch with Daniel. But thank you for the opportunity to share my projects with you.
Great, thank you, Gerhana. That was really interesting. So I will just again share my screen. So I'll just remind you again, we've got the question and answer function that you can have a look at. I've seen some of the answers have been questions, so hopefully you're able to see that. If you want to ask the questions, I encourage you to do that. It really adds to this webinar and our learning. So I'd like to introduce our third and final speaker for today. So Hoa Young is a senior lighting designer at Arup and a PhD candidate at the Department of Art, Design and Architecture at Monash University. Hoa specializes in daylight and experiential lighting design in her role at Arup and has extensive experience in local and international arts and culture, public infrastructure and urban realm projects. Hoa's practice brings together 24-hour lighting design with human-centric strategies to transform experiences for minority groups within the built environment. Her current research focuses on the role of technical lighting parameters for positive nighttime experiences for intersectional people in public spaces. So I'd love to invite Hoa to present and share her screen. Thank you, Hoa.
Thanks for the introduction, Daniel. Might be evident that I've never actually read that out loud before. It seems like those sentences were quite a mouthful, so well done. Thanks to ITE for having me today. Yeah, and I just wanted to say thanks, Gerhana, for that brilliant presentation. It was really great to get a glimpse of the amazing work that you and Bernard have collaborated in. And I really love how you've broken movement in place into sort of tangible and modular infrastructure design interventions, which feel really manageable and enacting positive change. So yeah, thanks for that. Hi everyone, my name's Hoa. Let me just try and share my screen. Can I confirm that everyone can see this? Yeah, sweet. Cool. So my name's Hoa. I'm a lighting designer at Arup in the Melbourne office. And today I'll present on some research that the lighting team at Arup Melbourne completed in 2019, which uncovered some new knowledge on the role of lighting for perceptions of safety for women and girls in public spaces. I'll also briefly cover what we've done since the research and how we've applied these research findings onto project work centered on spatial inclusivity, livability and walkability. I'd first like to start my presentation by recognising that the research I'll be presenting today was conducted on the unceded lands of the Wurrung and the Burrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any Indigenous people in attendance today. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Have you ever felt unsafe walking alone at night? Or have you ever avoided a path that's really dark? Currently in Victoria, over 2/3 of all women feel unsafe while walking alone at night, compared to less than 1/3 of men. Before I get into sort of the research proper, here are sort of 3 main themes that underpin the work that I'll be presenting today. So the first one is the 24-hour city. Increasingly, we're working and socialising after dark, a concept referred to as the nighttime economy. To get people to participate and engage with the nighttime economy, we need to make them feel safe enough to move around at night. So the central idea being that if we can improve perceptions of safety for all groups of people within society at night, they'd would more likely use more public amenities and spaces after dark, which inherently increases crowds to reduce the likelihood of crime occurring. So allowing people to use our streets in hours of darkness, which isn't always, midnight, like around now, 5 or 6 in the afternoon during winter, when people are coming home from work or when they're wanting to go for a run outside. Secondly, our cities are becoming increasingly diverse. Those who shape and build our cities need to reflect the people who use them. This research was an opportunity to interrogate in practice the idea that design decisions made for our cities are not adequately addressing the needs of female and gender diverse people. And lastly, we're seeing lighting technology in the past decade grow to be more cost-effective, sustainable, and tailored to the individual experience. But currently, street lighting design standards and best practice in exterior lighting is still extremely car-centric and not people-centric, in that a lot of urban lighting design or street lighting design is geared towards avoiding car crashes or being able to see well when you're driving, rather than things like placemaking, walkability, or the experience of safety and comfort of the people on our streets. And as most of you probably already know, already new and retrofitted lighting opportunities are happening all around us, with smart cities and smart lighting, which present an opportunity for city design to use light to create more inclusive and place-based urban experiences. So back in 2016, XYX Lab, which is a research PhD lab at Monash University, in collaboration with Plan International, asked young women and girls in Melbourne to share their experience of the city. So they did this through a crowdsourcing app called the Free to Be campaign, where people were able to go onto it and pin specific sites and add comments to where they experienced harassment or assault across Melbourne. This app was online for 3 months and collected a data set of over 900 pins. So what you see on the screen is a screen grab of what was collected. So the red dots are the unsafe sites and the green dots are the safe sites. So the bigger the circle, the higher the number of people who pinned it as a safe or unsafe site. The study in Melbourne was a prototype, and similar studies have been conducted in 5 other cities worldwide, including Delhi, Madrid, Lima, Kampala, and Sydney, with each study collecting over 3,000 people's responses. Now, I'd been following XYX Lab for a long time, and when these results were released, I wasn't really that surprised. As a person who's visibly a minority, I'm always on high alert every time I'm walking alone at night. Our physical abilities, the way we look, and our past experiences can all affect the way we move around the city at night. It influences whether people avoid a certain part of the city, feel comfortable using social amenities like public transport, or even leave their house after dark at all. So there are huge social and economic consequences if people don't feel safe enough to walk around alone at night. While this experience of feeling unsafe in the city is widely known, the data set collected from the Free to Be campaign is the first time things like harassment and abuse, which aren't usually captured in official crime statistics, have been linked to physical attributes or urban infrastructure in the city. And what was really interesting about the findings in the Free to Be study was that over a third of pins across Melbourne specifically mentioned lighting as a contributing factor to feeling safe or unsafe. Outside of social factors, lighting was the highest environmental factor to affect perceptions of safety for women and girls. The city and our experiences of public space works as a system of layers. At night, I like to think that lighting is the one thing that allows for all of these layers to work seamlessly together by giving us vision. Considered lighting will allow us to enjoy our public spaces at night, while bad lighting can make a space feel harsh and unfriendly. What we're still yet to understand as an industry is measured evidence that shows how specific elements of light makes women and girls feel when they say that it's bad or good, beyond, oh, it's just too dark or too bright. So what we were interested in at Arup was how we can listen to these lived experiences to inform how we specify and design urban lighting for more gender sensitive and inclusive nighttime experiences in practice. So we got in touch with XYX Lab, and we're very grateful to be able to start a research collaboration with them to see if we could add some quantitative measurements to figure out a more nuanced way of what it is exactly that makes women and girls feel safe or unsafe from lights in the city. So we picked 84 sites where the data showed hotspots from the community feedback, and also places where people specifically mentioned lighting. And over 4 weeks, between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. In the sweaty Melbourne summer, a colleague of mine and I went out and measured 84 sites in total. So out of that, we measured 26 safe spots and 58 unsafe spots. And to put this research into context, it's vital to consider how external spaces are currently lit in Australia and New Zealand. Exterior lighting standards focus heavily on the evenness and the intensity of light falling on the surface. So this is otherwise known as the illuminance levels or lux falling onto a surface, as you can see in the image on the left. What the standards don't take into account is the human experience of how we see and feel under all of these different sort of technical specifications that are being considered in a lighting design project. So beyond this, the lighting standards, the exterior lighting standards are also based on a whole slew of research based on the needs of the Caucasian man, which haven't really been revised in the past 20 or so years. And our hypothesis for the research was that we should be measuring for more than just illuminance. One key aspect of this is luminance. So luminance is the measurement, is a measurement that isn't captured in the standards. And it's about the, what it captures is the light bouncing off the surrounding environment back into our eyes, and is what makes the left-hand side of this page feel a lot darker than the right-hand side of this page, even though they're receiving the same amount of light. So what we proposed was to take into account the overall context of a site and include different things like road colours, finishes, or ambient light from shop fronts, which can all add up to our perception of comfort and safety in the city. So we measured and analysed 8 different technical lighting parameters per site, where if you were meeting compliance, you'd only measure 3 of these things. We then also analysed the sites with the help of our in-house human factors specialists to look at the vulnerability for things like scales of architecture, footpath width, sight lines, and escape routes. This is a key part of investigating experiences of the night, because a large part of light is only experienced when it bounces off the surrounding environment. Of the 38 different physical attributes that we looked at, the 4 here on the slide were found to be significant. So site typology, the type of site, what the function of the site is, the vertical plane luminance ratio, so the brightness of your left-hand side compared to your right-hand side, the ground plane, so the width of the footpath, allowing people to, when they're walking towards people that they want to avoid, the ability to be able to move across to a different space along the footpath. And finally, escape routes, so being able to have clear sight lines to escape. So our findings validated our hypothesis and also debunked some long-held assumptions about how lighting can make a space feel safer. So we found that brighter lights don't make people feel safer. So in general, we found that once light levels pass a certain threshold, a space will start to feel unsafe. So currently, a common knee-jerk reaction for many asset owners is to add more lights to make a space feel safer. What the data is showing from people's lived experiences is that this is generally not true. We also found that quality, not quantity, is much more important when it comes to urban lighting. So the findings show that the quality of light output is much more important once a low level of light is reached. So one of these factors is color rendering, which is how accurate color is rendered by the light source compared to what it appears to be during daylight. This will allow for people to be able to accurately see shapes and color and to distinguish the difference between a person that's approaching them and the bush that's beside them. So our findings show that being able to see and make out an overall scene in front of you is much more important to women and girls than only being able to see someone's face as they're approaching. And lastly, layering and context. What was overwhelmingly common as well was that safer spaces tended to have much warmer light. You can see this here in the image of De Grave Street, which is a Melbourne laneway, which has a beautiful warm glow, and there's a layering of shop lighting, wall lighting, and the uplit focal glow of the facade that's Flinders Street Station at the very back. So the data set has shown that people prefer to dwell longer in warm flame-like colours at night. Currently, with smart cities, solar-powered lighting and LED technology, we're starting to see more and more colder temperature lights being installed. And our findings show that while this type of colour temperature might be good for cars and energy efficiency, it doesn't make pedestrians feel safer or comfortable. So while additional research is required to drive firm changes in policy, the findings from this preliminary study have allowed us to define a baseline that's required for a space to feel safe for young women and girls. It also suggests that the urban lighting standards and practices as they exist at the moment may not be considering the diversity of experiences that are out there. And with this data set, let's see if I can get video working. Right, cool. With this data set, we've started to overlay other information on a GIS map, such as tree coverage, acoustics, and pedestrian movement, to see if there are any sort of other correlations between things that we haven't been able to uncover in the past. Ultimately, over time, with the layering of all of this digital data, we'll be able to make holistic design decisions that we know will create safer and more equitable cities for the future. Since this research project, we've developed an evidence-based methodology called the Nighttime Vulnerability Assessment, also known as the MVA, as the first step to implementing this evidence-based process when designing for gender-sensitive safety on urban projects. So this methodology identifies and recommends practical design changes to nighttime spaces by looking at vulnerability at 3 levels. So the first level being social, second environmental, and third technical lighting. So the assessment looks beyond the standards and weaves lived experiences with the technical components of lighting design and CPTED practices through data capture and analysis to make design decisions aimed at improving community safety at night, which are then validated in our nighttime co-design workshops. So a project that we've been lucky enough to apply these findings or this MVA process on recently was with the City of Whittlesea, who approached us to develop some high-level lighting design guidelines that they can use to improve perceptions of community safety at night on their shared user paths. And I saw before that our client from the council, Russ, is also on the call today. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that it does take pioneering people in our industry like Russ to take a leap of faith from a typical sort of lighting, road lighting approach and engage with people like us in the pursuit to make our cities a lot more accessible and inclusive at night. So massive shout out and thank you, Russ. So what we did was we conducted a nighttime vulnerability on 3 shared user paths in the City of Whittlesea. There's a lot of data crunching, made this extra small to not share any trade secrets. But yeah, so we sort of, what we did was we went out and to 3 different sites in shared user paths, and then did a whole bunch of measurements based on the research methodology. And then we came back to the office and analysed all of that, in particular looking at the perceptions of brightness, which is the luminance measurement that I was speaking to before. And then we also compared a lot of the current existing conditions to the baseline of lighting that we collected from the research to see how we might be able to frame the guidelines and the discussions in the workshops to tease out whether applying those technical parameters within a lighting scheme might benefit the local community. So with those findings, that sort of formed the proceedings of our torch workshops. So we run these nighttime torch workshops with community members. We use dolphin torches from Bunnings, they're $10. We've run them before with really technical sort of lighting instruments, and people just didn't want to touch them. So we found that having something that's quite easy to play with, a lot more accessible for community members. And so, we'll go through a couple of sort of design challenges, I'd say, listening to the experiences of the local community and then giving them the sort of knowledge and tools of how they could use lighting to improve their perception of safety. And then we'll do a couple of prototype sort of things on site to see what the community actually want. So then what we do with that later on, we'll consolidate sort of the key themes, and then what we've done with the City of Whittlesea is come up with 5 key themes and a design concept package that they can now give to consultants working on any shared user path lighting projects. We've also provided them sort of a matrix of technical requirements to aid the implementation of that. And then another project where we've implemented these findings in a design concept or in a lighting design project was with on WPA in Werribee Station, which is in collaboration with Hassel. So when we before we got onto the project, all they were going to do was have these sort of street lights, which are quite glary, and leave all of the underside of this new highway completely dark at nighttime. And there's a skate park there. And so we sort of got on, we were like, well, if you try and activate this space a little more, it won't feel so glary and scary when you're walking through here, because with the amount of light that's coming out of these street lamps, everything else will seem completely pitch black in comparison. So you'll be walking and you won't be able to see what's going on around you. So this image, the lights haven't really been aimed yet because I took these images while we were on the site visit. But what we've tried to do is light up the vertical surfaces and create like a warm atmosphere that seems quite inviting for people to come and visit at nighttime. But at the same time, what it also does is it allows for this pathway that's connecting to suburbs to be a lot more friendly and accessible at nighttime because of the sort of graduation, the gradual brightness of the surrounding environment. And outside of this, we're also looking at how we can use big data and digital tools to look at the experience of nighttime more holistically when it comes to walkability. So this is a planning tool that takes the 15-minute neighbourhood and which is outlined with the isochrone there, and it predicts a person's perception of brightness and safety when they're getting from point A to B at night, to sort of help walkability at a larger scale on precinct design or infrastructure. So yeah, we've also started to look at how we can take this methodology and apply a similar approach to develop urban lighting strategies to meet the needs of other marginalised groups, such as age, ability, or ethnicity, and in particular for those who sit at the intersection of more than one of these marginalised groups. And you know, in a world that's waking up to all the different permutations of social injustice and inequality, this research has really allowed us at Arup to completely turn the traditional lighting design process on its head and pioneer new methods of inclusive and experience-based nighttime design for people. Thanks for your time today. I look forward to any questions you might have. I've got my details there if you want to get in contact. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Howard. That was yeah, that was really, really interesting. So if you stop sharing your screen, and then we can answer a few of the questions. So we've got a couple of minutes left. Before we get into questions, I'd just like to remind you that attendance for this can be claimed as 1.5 hours of CBD. And if you're interested in any other things that ITE do, please follow us on all the socials, and we can connect you as well with speakers if you didn't manage to grab an email or contact details. So please follow us on LinkedIn. Would be the best place, or the website. And the webinar has been recorded, so hopefully that will all work and we'll be able to get that link out to you in the coming days. So yeah, thank you again to all our speakers. I found it really interesting and loved the journey from the macro to planning to then really getting into the those individual elements. So thank you again. We've had a couple of questions come through. One we had that has been answered that I thought would be good to throw to you would be, at the start we talked about movement and place, and there's a lot of different elements in that, and I guess trying to balance all those different elements. It'd be good to hear any challenges or things that you've learned. Gerhana, you mentioned before, like you had to refine one of the movement and place values, which I think is a good thing to think about. Is there anything you'd like to add to how you deal with all those different elements?
I'm quite thankful I have burnout to navigate those administrative processes that DOT would require in terms of making any amendment to the movement and place classification burnout. But I think in terms of forecasting what is in the future, my biggest challenge is in the growth area, because a lot of the place and the movement are not classified and probably are just becoming like a gaps in the whole network. So that's mainly the challenges today that we're grappling with, because they're not established, they're not done, they're not there yet. How can that retrofitting urban structures be avoided in day one, and investment be put in day one? How can we convince that there is going to be demand when there is nothing there yet?
From my perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges is a lot of the classifications still being refined. So a lot of the different classifications have been mapped based on statewide data or smart roads. But I mean, Gerhana mentioned before with the place classifications, it's predominantly based on zoning, and in reality, it should be a lot more fine-grained than that. So, if you're working on a project, one of the biggest challenges that I've found is actually just validating those classifications and just checking against local strategies and policies and all of that. So still a way to go.
Can I add one more?
Yeah, go for it.
And this is all very inspired through Hoa's presentation, which I thought is super interesting, because one thing that my issue with walking, particularly walking, because there are probably not enough resources out there to measure what walkable space actually looks like. So a lot of if you look at the technical appendix in Movement and Place, in terms of defining walkability, one is often about the basic needs of footpath. Emerging findings talks about crossing and frequency of crossing and safety of crossing. But these street users, who walks, they're mostly women, mostly young people with no licenses. What are their needs? Because not all walkers are the same. And think maybe from safety and amenity, going beyond the physical basic requirement of footpath and crossing, perhaps going into the next layer of experiential quality and understanding who are actually the target audience here that we're trying to deal with would be very useful.
And we've got a question about e-scooters, but before we do that one, I think just following on from that question and some of those answers, and one for you, Hoa, I was just thinking about what you presented, and I know for myself as an engineer, like doing things like road safety audits, often a lot of the things you talked about aren't considered. We kind of stick to guidelines or that kind of thing. Where do you see this kind of going in the future in terms of those considerations towards lighting?
Hopefully some policy changes. That's what we'd like to do. I think the key missing piece with a lot of standards and lighting requirements on projects at the moment aren't necessarily based on like a very wide section of people's experiences. So I think gathering enough data for us to build up a case to do that would be the next step. Ultimately we want to take over the world and change the policy, but I think change is incremental. And we do small projects like the one on WPA or with City of Whittlesea to sort of test out these methodologies so that we can improve it for the future.
Yeah, great. And I think we've got time for 2 more questions. So if anyone wants to quickly type one in, feel free. So we had a question about e-scooters and how they, do they belong on the network? Where do they fit in? Anything that any of you would like to add around e-scooters?
I'm happy to kick off this one. It's the
Go
black
for it.
sheep of the model family, because nobody knows where they belong. So we have the same topic of debate at Wyndham. Wyndham really wants to push e-scooters, e-bikes as part of their preferred vehicle, because they rather deal with that than deal with cars, which is really interesting way of looking at it. And in terms of the coverage, normally it goes to 5-6 kilometers long, so definitely more than walking. So we've decided in the Wyndham context that in terms of, if you look like and quack like a duck, you are a duck. So e-bikes and e-scooters belong on a bike lane. It may not be the same position that Vic roads have, but from safety perspective, we definitely do not feel they belong in footpath. Because just from vulnerable street users, pedestrian perspective, safety, and even through the viability of how we can support street activities, e-scooters just don't line up with pedestrian movement. So we feel they should go to bike paths, and that should be part of the consideration.
Well, thank you. Any Bernard or Howard, do you have anything you'd like to add around e-scooters? No, that's all right.
I've covered it.
I've got one more question, and then we'll end that webinar. But like in a really brief, a couple of word answer. We had a question about key regional areas and what that might look like growing into the future. What would be like the one thing that you champion or love to see in terms of those regional areas and growing in the future? if one of you would like to answer that question.
I'll let the others go first.
Go for it, Bernard.
So regional cities like Bendigo, Geelong.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, growing and development in the future, what are some of the things you think will really be changing in those spaces?
Yeah, look, I think just, yeah, future-proofing our road planning and design from day one, just making sure that we're understanding and recognizing that our roads aren't just moving conduits, and just take that integrated approach to look at both land use and transport at the same time and design accordingly from day one. So using movement in place, which at the moment in growth areas is not considered at this point in time. So there needs to be some work to incorporate that into planning scheme and policy.
I wonder, yeah, go ahead, Thor, after you.
Yeah.
Oh, you go.
Go on, Hala.
I've already muted myself. Yeah, building on Bernard's mention of sort of integrating sort of different disciplines, I think with up and coming sort of areas, I think you've got this fantastic opportunity to start looking at things holistically, whereas, a bit more sort of antiquated systems, I don't know, that we've come across, community safety might not collaborate so much with traffic engineers or something, but you've got this sort of perfect opportunity to sort of start afresh and have everyone at the table so that you can come up with a lot more of a holistic design and something that is sort of socially and environmentally sustainable.
One thing that we may want to think about, just applying this to regional towns, which are very, very car dependent. I mean, there's not much option in terms of public transport in some of these areas. It's also building capacity and that culture. For lack of better terms, can we make walking sexy again? Seriously, it is part of that campaign and that education program. Not everyone knows how to cycle, surprise, surprise. So can we integrate that culture and build the capacity that everyone is responsible in creating safe streets? And who actually are the most passionate about creating safe streets? People who live on that streets. So this is an experience that we learn through Darabin Streets for People, is creating that street champion groups. And we particularly actually handpick them so they don't all represent one type of street users. We got moms, we got kids, we got migrants, we got all sorts of community members. And we make them put an expression of interest that they want to be a street champion for their streets, where our projects were, because I think what's the challenge about consultancy, which I'm sure you guys agree with me, once your project is done, that's it for us. And council officers changes over time. So there is no continuity in terms of place investment. And we know through streets and place, they need long-term investment. So who else is best placed to be the custodian of this place, if not the community and the residents? So we need to empower them to be able to do that. So a bit of grassroots, community movement is needed here as part of the change.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you again, and on behalf of ITE, just a really big thank you for coming and presenting, and thank you to everyone that's jumped online to be a part of this. I know a few people have asked for contact details, so I'm sure we'll be able to help you out through messages through LinkedIn, or we'll provide some things on the website along with the recording of this webinar. But I think I'll leave it there. Remember YITE events coming up, and I hope you all have a really great evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.